Hello and welcome to the Canon Reviewed, a podcast that looks at old books with new eyes and examines their continued relevance to contemporary readers. I'm your host, Daniel, and I'm delighted that you're here. Today, we finish our look at Shakespeare's Hamlet, one of, if not the, greatest plays of all time. But, does being great equal remaining relevant? Should we still read Hamlet? Well, pull up a chair by the fire, and let's talk about that. Okay, we're done with the long soliloquies that anchored each episode before this one. But that is not to say that Hamlet is done speaking. He still has a few famous lines and a lot to articulate before this play reaches its bodies strewn across the stage conclusion. Oh, sorry, then that was a spoiler. But before we get to Hamlet, who last we knew was on a ship to England to be executed, let's continue from where we left off. Okay, so last week, our final read came from King Claudius after Ophelia had wandered in, a little unhinged after the death of her father Polonius at the hands of her boyfriend, Prince Hamlet. It was too much for her to take, but she was escorted safely away. So, Claudius tells us about the poison of deep grief when there are sounds outside the gate. Claudius, revealing his cowardice, calls out for his Switzers, his Swiss guard, to bar the door, and he comes to learn that Laertes has returned from France, seeking revenge and justification for his father's death. Unlike Hamlet, Laertes intends to do something, and he barges in, apparently after having incited a mob, and demands answers from Claudius. Well, the king tells good Laertes who killed his dad, and spends some time saying that he is guiltless, when once again Ophelia comes in, now totally cracked, throwing flowers around and singing. It's too much for Laertes, and the king seizes upon the young man's vulnerability at this moment. Claudius tells him he communes with his grief, feels terrible about what happened, and if he's guilty in any way, he'll give the kingdom up to Laertes. And then ominously, he ends with this: "Where the offense is, let the great axe fall." Well, he then asks Laertes to follow him where they can conspire in secret. The king will soon show himself to be the master of manipulation, and Laertes will reveal himself to be the easiest of marks. We then cut briefly to a scene where a sailor hands Horatio a letter from Hamlet, who tells how he was taken prisoner by some pirates, but that he promised something good to them for repayment for returning him to Denmark. He isn't sneaking home either, as he asks Horatio to give the king some letters. And he concludes by saying he's got some wild stuff to tell Horatio when they see each other again. So, that messenger with the letters arrives with those letters from Hamlet, announcing that Hamlet is returning to Denmark after being captured by pirates. Now, this unexpected news shocks Claudius, as he had arranged for Hamlet's execution in England. But this means he's got to get to work. And he starts in on Laertes, telling him how Hamlet killed his father, really giving details. And he finally gets Laertes worked up enough that when he asks what he wants, Laertes responds with, "To cut his throat in the church." Yikes. But why is Hamlet still alive anyway? Why did you let him go? Asks Laertes. Well, says Claudius, the people love him. And the play has hinted to Claudius's lack of popularity a few times. And even more than that, his mom dotes on him. But back to this throat-cutting bit. Claudius tells Laertes that while Hamlet is an arrogant butthole, he has one little weakness. He'd always get angry and jealous when someone talked about how great Laertes was with a sword. So he's been clamoring for a duel with you forever, Laertes, so to prove, that he's better than you. So how about this? Claudius then devises a plan to ensure Hamlet's death upon his return. He suggests that Laertes challenge Hamlet to a duel. Claudius proposes to poison the tip of Laertes' sword, so even a small scratch would be lethal. And as an additional measure, Claudius plans to offer Hamlet a poisoned goblet of wine during the duel in case the whole poisoned sword thing fails. Laertes says, "Hell yeah!" But just then Gertrude enters with the tragic news that Ophelia has drowned. Now Laertes is devastated by the loss of his sister, and this just serves to strengthen his resolve to kill Hamlet. So ends Act 4. The final act of Hamlet begins with Hamlet and Horatio traipsing back into Denmark as they find themselves in the graveyard outside Elsinore Castle. This scene is the play's comic relief, for we meet the gravedigger, a clownish fool who doesn't know what Hamlet looks like but tells the two that the prince was sent off because he's mad. Again, that theme of madness and such reveals itself here as well. Now, Horatio watches as Hamlet picks up skulls lying around, imagining who they belong to, ruminating on the fact that death essentially undoes everything we once thought mattered about life. So, existentialist ideas emerge forth once more. Now, one skull in particular both amuses and ultimately horrifies Hamlet once the gravedigger identifies it as the late king's jester, who would play with Hamlet when he was a boy. Now, most people have heard how his thoughts begin here, but the whole thing is thematically important, and its comic nature hides the melancholy Hamlet feels about all this death and meaningless stuff. Alas, poor Yorick! I knew him, Horatio. A fellow of infinite jest, of most excellent fancy. He hath borne me on his back 1,000 times, and now how abhorred in my imagination it is. My gorge rises at it. Here hung those lips that I have kissed I know not how oft. Where be your jibes now? Your gambols, your songs, your flashes of merriment that were wont to set the table on a roar? Not one now to mock your own grinning? Quite chapfallen? Now get you to my lady's chamber and tell her, let her paint an inch thick. To this favor she must come. Make her laugh at that. Then, Hamlet and Horatio see a funeral procession coming into the cemetery, and they hide to see what's happening. Now, as soon as he hears Laertes lamenting his dead sister, Hamlet leaps onto the scene, and he and Laertes have a scuffle. Hamlet is clearly distressed, claiming he loved Ophelia, and he's mystified by Laertes' attack upon him. I loved you ever, says Hamlet. But then he makes fun of Laertes a bit by mocking his grief, saying he doesn't have to resort to the maudlin actions to prove it. The queen is able to placate Laertes by telling him that Hamlet's lost his mind, and they all go off. The king holds Laertes back and reminds him of the upcoming event. Don't lose your head, boy. You'll have your revenge soon enough. Now, the next scene is really cool. It's just Horatio and Hamlet alone, and Hamlet tells Horatio what he'd been up to on his travels to England. He unsealed the letter he carried and saw that he was to die, so he forged a new one that said to kill the bearers of this letter, Rosencrantz and Guildenstern, and he knows that they're dead. Horatio seems a bit shocked, but Hamlet's all like, well, they deserved it. They're not on my conscience. And now that he's back, knowing that he was supposed to die, he understands the danger he's in, and he confesses that it's his duty to kill Claudius. But he does feel bad for losing himself to Laertes. He likes Laertes, and sees in him a mirror image of himself, and he vows to make it up to him. Just then, a courtier comes in to inform Hamlet of the duel, a playful game between him and Laertes. The arena is getting set up as we speak. Will you do it? Of course, replies Hamlet, and the courtier leaves. And when they're alone again, Horatio's like, Hamlet, you're gonna lose. But Hamlet smugly shrugs that off, saying he's been practicing a lot since Laertes went to France. But yet, I do have some misgivings, he says, but they're womanly. Ugh. Well, listen to your heart then, says Horatio. I'll go and tell them something to put this off. But Hamlet's reply to this is beautiful. He says, not a whit. We defy augury. There is a special providence in the fall of a sparrow. If it be now, 'tis not to come. If it be not to come, it will be now. And if it be not now, yet it will come. The readiness is all. Since no man of aught he leaves knows. What is it to leave betimes? Let be. Basically, he's saying here that we can't predict the future, and if something is fated to be, it will be. You just have to be ready. And since you don't know what you leave behind when you die, what does it matter if you die young? He hears trumpets announcing the beginning of the sword play. And before they lock swords, Hamlet wants to apologize to Laertes, and I've always maintained that he's incredibly sincere at this moment. And it's partly why Laertes will confess to everything once it's too late for everyone involved. Laertes feels bad for what he has done to Hamlet. And I think this apology is the reason. Hamlet says, "Give me your pardon, sir. I have done you wrong. But pardon it as you are a gentleman. This presence knows, and you must needs have heard how I am punished with a sore distraction. What I have done that might your nature, honor, and exception roughly awake, I here proclaim was madness. Was Hamlet wrong, Laertes? Never Hamlet. If Hamlet from himself be taken away, and when he's not himself does wrong Laertes, then Hamlet does it not. Hamlet denies it. Who does it then? His madness. If it be so, Hamlet is of the faction that is wronged. His madness is poor Hamlet's enemy. Sir, in this audience, let my proclaiming from a purposed evil free me so far in your most generous thoughts that I have shot my arrow o'er the house and hurt my brother." Now, while it may be sincere, it is also Hamlet kind of not taking the blame for any wrongdoing he's done. I believe he's upset that Laertes is upset, sure, but he's like, look, I was crazy, so it's not really me that did anything. But remember, we already know that the crazy thing is an act. Laertes doesn't know that, but Hamlet does. So it's sincere of a sort. Anyway, they begin, and Hamlet scores the first hit. Now, the king sees that he is indeed good, maybe even better than Laertes, and he motions to the poisoned cup and tells Hamlet to drink in celebration of his skill. "Nah, too soon," his nephew replies. He scores a second hit on Laertes. The queen drinks to his honor, though Claudius says, "No, Gertrude, do not drink." Hamlet mocks Laertes. "This easy? Come at me, man." And Laertes does so and slashes Hamlet, wounding him. They scuffle a bit, and in that wrestling they switch swords, and Hamlet cuts Laertes as well. Now, both are bleeding, both wounded by the envenomed blade. Hamlet's about to charge when the queen falls. Before dying, she claims the wine was poisoned. Hamlet yells to shut the door. There's some villainy at court. But Laertes drops to his knees and says, "It is you, Hamlet. Hamlet, thou art slain. No medicine in the world can do thee good. In thee there is not a half hour's life. The treacherous instrument is in thy hand, unbaited and envenomed. The foul practice hath turned itself on me. Lo, here I lie, never to rise again. Thy mother's poisoned. I can no more. The king's to blame." So, Hamlet, hearing this, stabs the king, a mere scratch, but it will be enough, and he then forces Claudius to drink from the cup. The king dies, and Laertes says that it was just, and he begs Hamlet's forgiveness. Now, Hamlet grants it, of course, and he watches as Laertes expires. Then Hamlet falls, and Horatio cradles him in his arms. And as he holds his dead friend tightly to him, young Fortinbras comes on the scene with some English ambassadors and is like, what the hell happened here? And Horatio's like, "Oh, I could a tale unfold that you'd hardly believe." "Well, I'd like to hear it," says Fortinbras, and he orders the bodies removed. And of Hamlet he says, "Let 4 captains bear Hamlet like a soldier to the stage, for he was likely, had he been put on, to have proved most royal. And for his passage, the soldier's music and the right of war speak loudly for him. Take up the bodies. Such a sight as this becomes the field, but here shows much amiss. Go, bid the soldiers shoot." Well, there you have it. Shakespeare's Hamlet, poorly summarized. A tale of madness and revenge, penned over 400 years ago and still as culturally, dramatically, and historically important as ever. But really, so what? Sure, it's old, and yes, it's good, and the plot arc of Hamlet has defined storytelling for centuries, but does that mean it's still a relevant piece of work? Worth the time it takes to engage with it on a level of deeper understanding? Let's talk about that. So, I suppose we need to begin here by addressing some comments I made a while back on a previous mailbag episode. In it, I talked about how my daughter Elsa's 8th grade would no longer teach Shakespeare, and I came to the conclusion that maybe that's okay. that something as complex language-wise as a Shakespeare play can be put on the shelf for a much later time when, say, a student might find herself in possession of a genuine interest in pursuing the bard and his works. Sure, every part of my literature degree English teacher body recoiled initially, but the more I thought about it, well... But this is Hamlet! My favorite play of all time! Maybe I just meant other Shakespeare stuff, like, those lame comedies. Everyone should read Hamlet in high school, at least, right? Well, before answering that, let's look at what the text itself offers to a younger or first-time reader. By looking at those questions we ask of everything under study here at the Canon Reviewed. Themes, character, aspects of storytelling, language, all that. As I've been writing these past 5 episodes, something has been nagging at me a little bit. Now, while I love Hamlet, the character, this deep dive into the play through the major soliloquies has got me asking myself why I like the play so much. I know I've said a bunch of times that Shakespeare created a kind of story structure template with Hamlet, but I suppose one could say the same thing about Macbeth or Romeo and Juliet. I mean, maybe I only say it about Hamlet because it's my favorite of Shakespeare's plays. The point I'm trying to make here is that, story-wise, if we're being honest, there isn't really anything that makes this play exceptional, in the literal sense of the word. I mean, basically, Hamlet follows the same structured plot arc of all of his tragedies. Ultimately, that's a good thing. And what we recognize in Hamlet's pace and build, as with other Shakespeare's plays, is just how a good writer makes a good story. Hamlet, for all its existentialist themes and all that, is really a plot-driven story. It's all action, really, which is odd since the character, Hamlet, is all inaction. But one thing leads to another, all quite reasonably and logically, and as such the play is easy to follow. No young or first-time reader will be thrown by the plot of Hamlet. So we see in the play the skeleton required of a story's skin. Did Shakespeare invent that? No, probably not. But did he perfect it? Yes, I think so. The best stories today, especially the really popular franchises, they kind of follow the Hamlet model to almost a T. Now, of course, this doesn't mean automatic relevance for Hamlet. It too owes a great deal to the events and stories that preceded it. But it's nice that a younger reader could dive into Hamlet and at least not feel at sea as she wanders through the events of the tale. But Hamlet is obviously a great deal more than a logical sequence of events. But what makes that so? Well, the answer, turns out, is quite simple. Hamlet himself. It's Hamlet's ruminations on the events that resonate with us. His vulnerability, his openness, his philosophical mind, his humor, his ability to act and play parts, to analyze situations, to understand people. He's contradictory, messed up, just like us. When he should be leading with his heart, he leads with his head, and he is often blind to the damage he does. And like us, he can be temperamental, unforgivingly mean-spirited, prone to fits of melancholy that divorce him from his best judgment. In short, Hamlet is one of the most well-rounded characters of all time. While many of the play's characters fulfill roles, Hamlet is a person. We come to the play for him. We can't take our eyes off him. We love him. And we deplore him, we support him, and we vilify him. We want what's best for him, but he frustrates us at almost every turn. It's rather impossible not to identify with the guy. When we imagine ourselves placed in the chaos that is our day-to-day lived experience, we see in Hamlet our own desperate attempts to make sense of things. Hamlet is so real because he is so flawed. He makes mistakes. He hurts people he shouldn't. He realizes too late the damage he's caused. He is naive enough to believe the people around him see things as he does. I mean, he is blindsided by Ophelia's death, incapable of seeing how his actions led to it. He is surprised by the anger of Laertes in the duel and his villainy, thinking that his apology mattered. And when his best friends, Rosencrantz and Guildenstern, betray him, as he thinks, he has them killed. But what could they do? They had no choice but to fulfill Claudius's orders, and they were trying to help Hamlet in their way. No, Hamlet can't see past his own self, as if it's the only thing that he does that matters. Rosencrantz and Guildenstern weren't thwarting him. They reported really not a single useful bit of information to the king about Hamlet. You know, I feel like sometimes the older a work is, the less a contemporary reader is likely to expect that the text has deep and rich characters. Well, Hamlet, the prince, is that, deep and rich. We see in him our own good and bad qualities, and we admire him sometimes and shake our heads too. Now let's turn our attention to some of those things that may push a new or younger reader away from Hamlet. And here we'll probably touch on some of those ideas I mentioned in the mailbag episode. Thematically, is Hamlet all that interesting? I mean, really, it's a revenge story with a fairly methodical plot leading to all the bodies on the stage. Yes, we confront some interesting ideas about madness, religion, and the nature of acting, some cool supernatural stuff. And Hamlet is most compelling in its exploration of the unintended consequences for our actions. 2, how Shakespeare manages the ways in which Hamlet is used and made vulnerable through his grief is pretty cool. I mean, ultimately, though, this is a play meant to be entertaining to a live audience. So, while the soliloquies are lofty at times and deeply philosophical, sure, you can't spend too much time on that stuff if you want to keep the groundlings engaged. To be fair, though, Hamlet is full of depth in places, and its meditations on life and death, action and inaction, good and evil, well, they're really quite compelling. But, and this matters, the character of Hamlet hasn't aged well in many ways. And we can't lean on the whole "he was a product of his time" nonsense when it comes to those things that make him troubling to a contemporary reader. His brand of casual and callous misogyny hasn't aged well, for sure. His treatment of Ophelia is reprehensible. We know little to nothing about them other than what's presented on the stage, and he does his level best to make her feel small and unimportant throughout the play. He juggles with her emotions, kind one moment, berating her the next, and it's only at her funeral that he admits to his feelings. He reminds me of a high school boy, in fact, in his immaturity and petty meanness. Ophelia deserves none of what she receives at his hands. The name-calling, the twisting of her words, the death of her father. She's an innocent victim, and Hamlet uses her in his wild attempt to throw off his pursuers. But this is his girlfriend. He's written her love letters and poems, and suddenly he's calling her a whore and cursing her, only to next moment ask to sit in her lap during the play. And then all that stuff about "frailty thy name is woman," and how the prettier a woman is, the more danger she presents to men. These are tired, old, and well-worn tropes, to be sure. And as I mentioned before, he's casual about it. When asked if the play they'll be watching is brief, he replies, "As a woman's love." His relentless and withering attacks on his mother for her perceived weakness, the whole "don't you remember how great Dad was" stuff that never once gives over to the fact that she may possess some agency. In fact, it's rather suggested that she is a victim of witchcraft, too weak-minded to resist the machinations of Hamlet's too smart and clever uncle. Now, this stuff rightly doesn't sit well, and as glorious as "to be or not to be" is, it's hard to imagine that can overcome those things that make Hamlet such an asshole at times, and perhaps ultimately someone with whom we can't sympathize. So much is made of his plight and his agony that we often forget what he does to those around him. Ophelia for sure, but to believe, as he does, that Rosencrantz and Guildenstern deserved their fate is ridiculous. You know what it reminds me of? And this is really a personal observation. It reminds me of this. I feel like maybe I've always read and viewed and consumed Hamlet in the same way as I did Eliot's The Love Song of J. Alfred Prufrock. It's meaningful to me, sure, but there's something here akin to, when that friend of the show pointed out in the mailbag episode on Eliot's poem that it's scary and very different to be someone else, someone different from me, reading and experiencing this text. I can't deny that at all. And I think I see Hamlet a lot differently now because of that remark. Okay, I went long there, but a classic deserves to have its flaws examined as much as its finer qualities. Finally, though, there's what I mentioned long ago, that chief barrier to a younger reader's engagement with any Shakespeare text: the language. I don't want to repeat myself too much here, but one can't ignore that it's hard work reading Hamlet. No student is going to read it out loud and understand what's happening unless they've had some previous training and experience with Shakespeare. And in the time-pressed nature of literature classes in high school, where you gotta keep moving, get to the next unit, the next book, we do a great disservice to Shakespeare. You can't just read it once, and you also can't have your hand held through the whole reading of Hamlet and think you'll enjoy it. I fell into that trap all the time as a teacher. I spent weeks explaining all the lines as if that would suddenly move the kids to enjoy the play. But if there's no self-discovery, then what is there that could possibly engage you? So, I got a lot of responses to that mailbag episode. And the central point that a lot of folks made was that literature shouldn't be easy, that there is pleasure and power in the work of reading Shakespeare. And I 100% agree with that. I really do. But that said, I still maintain it's work that you should be able to choose to do. We start kids with Romeo and Juliet in 8th grade, and that's hard too. Kids can deal, though, because the play is so well known that the plot's already fixed in their minds. But they still struggle to understand what the characters are saying. I mean, basically, you just end up showing them West Side Story so they really get the play. Okay, maybe that was too flip. But my point is that a serious dive into Shakespeare should maybe be taken by invested readers who want to appreciate the importance, the historical importance of Shakespeare and his plays. You can't be an English major without him, and I would defy anyone who says otherwise. But since not everyone grows up to be an English major, a sad reality, by the way, then it's okay if some 10th grader would rather eat glue than read Hamlet. You can't love Shakespeare when he's an academic obligation. Actually, that's probably true of every text we'll look at on this podcast. Now, my suspicion is that my opinion isn't a popular one, and I confess to feeling like I should turn in my literature card for even suggesting that maybe Shakespeare isn't really all that relevant to new and contemporary readers. He is to me, but I am old and have had years to work on admiring and understanding the plays. Yet, not once but 4,000 times I have called Hamlet the greatest play ever written. And I mean it. So shouldn't that very fact, assuming my opinion is fact, make it required reading? Prove that it's still an important and necessary work? I confess, I'm torn here. Way more than I have been for any text so far that we've covered. I need to separate myself from the universe here, like I've tried to do with all the things we've studied. To be objective is very difficult with Hamlet, and I wonder if we can have it both ways somehow. Culturally, as storytellers and receivers of story, we owe an enormous debt to Shakespeare, and Hamlet in particular. Can we acknowledge that and move on? Yes, it's interesting that a structural template was perfected here, and it's important to know and understand that we've had 400 years of other writers using it in maybe a much more accessible manner. All right, I have made my decision. I am going to sit very uncomfortably on this fence here and throw the question back at you, dear listener and friend. What do you think? We spent more time with Hamlet than we have with any other book under study at the Canon Reviewed. I want to hear from you now. I've talked a lot, and there are much wiser scholars than me who've thought a lot about this kind of stuff. So please, let's keep this conversation going. I know many of you feel strongly about the ideas presented here, and I'd really like to engage with your ideas. I want to come back in a bit, do a kind of Hamlet Redux, where I share your thoughts and feelings, and I promise not to cop out again. I won't dodge my responsibility to render final judgment anymore after this. At least, not until the next time. Thank you so much for sitting by the fire with me. Please rate and review the podcast as it makes it easier for others to find. And if you like what you're hearing and intrigued by where it's going, please consider supporting the show on Patreon at www.patreon.com/The Canon Reviewed. You'll find a few tiers to choose from, as well as an invite to our Discord community. Now, I've begun to slowly put these episodes up on YouTube, so do me a favor and search for the podcast there and subscribe. I'd really appreciate it. Now look, as I say every time, this podcast is a conversation as much as anything else, so please send an email to thecanonreviewed@gmail.com with your thoughts and observations about the works under study, as I'd love to include them in future episodes. And this time, you know your task. What's your verdict? Where do you land on the relevancy question for Hamlet? I cannot wait to hear from you all. I'd like to take a quick moment here to thank our 3 head librarians, Jeff Seplak, Jesse Cunningham, and Jake Frounfelter, for their continued support on Patreon. You 3 are awesome, and I appreciate you so much. And you know who else I want to thank is Kevin MacLeod. It's his work that you hear in every one of these episodes, and the one I've played throughout this entire one, his track Ambiment. So thank you, Kevin. Well, let's end today's episode just as we should. Lying on the floor in his dear friend Horatio's arms, Hamlet knows he is dying. He has very little time to set things in order. Here are his final words. Oh, I die, Horatio. The potent poison quite o'ercrows my spirit. I cannot live to hear the news from England, but I do prophesy the election lights on Fortinbras. He has my dying voice, so tell him, with the occurrence, more and less, which have solicited, the rest is silence.